When you think about the concept of a contract today, there is this very specific expectation of transparency,
Right.
like a shared reality.
Yeah,
You
absolutely.
sit down, maybe in an office or, I don't know, at your kitchen table, and you read the terms, you negotiate a little bit, you sign on the dotted line,
Right.
and both parties are bound by this mutual understanding of what is actually going to happen next. It's clinical, it's predictable.
Safe faith.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it relies entirely on the assumption that the language on the page actually reflects the physical world.
Right, but you have to ask yourself what happens to that shared reality when you completely strip away the transparency.
Yeah.
I mean, what happens when the contract is not a reflection of truth, but an engineered mirage?
Oh, wow. A mirage. That's
Yeah, when the people pressing their ink-stained thumbs onto the paper are doing so in the dust of a village, thousands of miles away from the brutal truth of what they are actually agreeing to.
right.
That piece of paper is no longer a guarantee of employment, It becomes a weapon.
Oh, weapon. That is the exact word for it. And looking at this massive stack of sources we have for today's deep dive, we're talking historical ship manifests, 19th century colonial ledgers, diaries, documentaries. You don't just see a list of workers.
No, not at all.
You see the literal blueprints of an industrial scale deception. And for you listening right now, our mission for this deep dive is to explore this staggering, just heartbreaking gap between the deals that were whispered to vulnerable farmers in the villages of India and the stark, unforgiving reality they face the moment their feet hit the Mauritian shores.
It really is a history written in the salt of the Indian Ocean and deep in the volcanic soil of our sugar fields.
Yeah.
When my grandparents and the elders spoke of this time, they didn't speak of contracts or administrative labor shifts.
What do they call it?
They spoke of a profound betrayal.
Wow.
But, and this is crucial, they also spoke of survival.
Oh.
It's heavy, right? It's heavy to look at the mechanics of this exploitation, but we really must understand the machinery of the trap to truly understand how our ancestors managed to break it.
I am so glad you said that.
Yeah.
Because I want to make that completely clear to you listening to us right now. While we are absolutely going to dissect the mechanics of a deeply predatory global system of labor extraction today, this is not just a story of victimization.
Not at all.
If you look closely at these documents, a completely different narrative emerges. This is ultimately a story of incredible, almost unfathomable human triumph.
Yeah, the resilience is it's unmatched.
Right. It's about how people who are imported to be disposable cogs in a colonial agricultural machine somehow found the psychological strength to preserve their humanity and eventually to build a beautifully diverse modern nation.
Exactly.
So we need to go back to the catalyst, the moment the world shifted, and that brings us to the year 1833.
Right. To understand the seismic shock of 1833, you really must first understand the island of Mauritius itself.
Set the scene for us.
Well, if you look at a map, we are this tiny emerald speck sitting in the vastness of the Indian Ocean.
Way out there.
Yeah, far to the east of Madagascar and the African continent. Because of that strategic positioning, isolated but central to the trade winds, it has always been a place of constant arrival and violent turnover.
Like a revolving door of empires.
Precisely. I mean, the Dutch occupied it first from around 1638 until 1710, and they left behind little more than the extinction of the dodo bird, honestly.
Yeah, the poor dodo. And then the French arrive, right,
Yeah.
in 1715.
Yes. The French took possession, they renamed it Ile de France, and this is where the dark heart of the plantation economy truly takes root.
Right.
They brought over enslaved people, predominantly from Madagascar and the East African coast, to violently clear these dense indigenous forests and plant the rapidly expanding sugar fields.
It was an exceptionally brutal regime.
It was.
Right.
But looking at the early census data in our sources, it's fascinating to note that they also brought over around 12,000 Indians during this French period.
Wait, really? Because that completely upends the common timeline people have in their heads.
It does.
There's this early connection between India and Mauritius that predates the massive wave of indentured labor by, decades?
Decades, yeah. These early arrivals were mostly skilled artisans, stonemasons, blacksmiths, carpenters brought from French trading posts in India, like Pondicherry.
Okay, so they weren't all enslaved.
Some were enslaved, yes, but others were free men. In fact, after some legislative changes in, I think 1767, some of those early Indian immigrants were allowed to buy land and start their own small businesses in Port Louis.
Oh, wow. So a very faint early precedent of an Indian presence was already established in the soil.
Exactly. But then, as always happened in the colonial era, global power dynamics shifted again.
Enter the British.
Enter the British. During the Napoleonic Wars, they blockaded the island, and following a massive naval invasion in November 1810, the British seized total control of Mauritius.
And that British takeover leads us directly to our catalyst, because in 1833, the British Empire passes the Slavery Abolition Act.
Right.
This is a monumental, world-changing piece of legislation. In Mauritius alone, it mandates the liberation of roughly 65,000 African and Malagasy enslaved people.
And you really must try to imagine the atmosphere, the thick tension on the island at that exact moment.
I can't even imagine.
The entire economic engine of Mauritius, the source of immense wealth for the Franco-Mauritian elite, was sugarcane.
Right.
And sugarcane is notoriously demanding. It requires heavy, exhaustive, dangerous cultivation. For generations, the blood and sweat of enslaved people had literally fertilized those fields.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly, by decree of the British Crown in London, the legal chains are broken.
Which is, an incredible overdue victory for human rights.
Of course.
But for the Franco-Mauritian plantation owners, these sugar oligarchs who were allowed to keep their vast landholdings even under British rule, this was a moment of absolute sheer terror.
Complete panic.
Because what happened next was a massive, unprecedented labor strike, essentially.
Yeah. The newly freed men and women did exactly what any rational human being in their position would do.
They walked away.
They looked at the sugarcane fields, the physical sites of their torture, the places where their ancestors had been beaten, the absolute embodiment of their forced low social status, and they turned their backs on them.
Good for them.
Right. They carried a deep, entirely justified generational disdain for agricultural labor on those specific estates. The colonial administrators, they thought they could pay them a pittance to keep working.
Just a few cents to stay in the same terrible condition.
Exactly. But the freed population refused. They quit the fields almost entirely.
This is a massive logistical nightmare for the elite. Where did 65,000 people go? How do they survive without the estates?
Well, they sought dignity. Many moved to the coasts to utilize the ocean, becoming fishermen.
Okay.
Others moved into the capital to become craftsmen, carpenters, or stevedores down by the docks. And many simply moved to the fringes of the island, the difficult, uncleared lands, and became independent subsistence farmers.
Just living off the land themselves.
Yeah. They actively chose material poverty, so long as it came with physical freedom, over the horrific, degrading conditions of the sugar estates.
It makes complete sense.
Yeah.
If I try to picture this in a more modern, relatable way for you listening, and obviously this is an imperfect analogy, but it helps visualize the economic shock.
Sure.
Think of a massive, heavily polluting factory town.
Yeah.
The kind where the workers are treated terribly, no safety standards, awful pay.
Right.
Suddenly the workers realize they aren't legally bound to the factory anymore, and they realize the conditions are fundamentally inhumane.
Mm-hmm.
So overnight, the entire workforce just rightfully walks out.
Just drops their tools.
Exactly. They go start their own small businesses, they learn new trades, they refuse to step foot in that toxic factory ever again, no matter what the bosses say.
And the machinery simply stops. And the sugarcane, a crop that waits for no man, begins to rot in the fields. Fortunes were just evaporating in the sun.
And here is where it gets incredibly dark. Because the owners of that factory, the Franco-Mauritian sugar oligarchs, didn't pause and think, wow, our system is fundamentally broken. Maybe we should radically improve working conditions, offer fair competitive wages, and treat these newly freed people as equal partners in our economy.
Ah, no. They definitely did not do that.
No, they just panicked and started searching the globe for a new place to source the absolute cheapest, most exploitable, most legally vulnerable labor to replace the people who had just walked out.
They were utterly desperate to maintain their profit margins, and so in collaboration with the British government, they invented a new legal fiction.
A legal fiction?
Yes, they called it indentured labor. And it is vital to understand that this massive system, which would eventually spread across the globe to the Caribbean, Fiji, and South Africa, was conceptualized, beta-tested, and implemented first right here in Mauritius.
Wait. Mauritius was the testing ground for the whole world.
Yes, we were the laboratory for this new form of extraction.
Wow. So my big question here is, why did these panicked oligarchs look all the way across the ocean to India specifically to solve this labor crisis? The British Empire was vast. Why target the Indian subcontinent?
It was a matter of grim imperial convenience and, frankly, calculated vulnerability.
How so?
Well, the British controlled both the island of Mauritius and vast swaths of India. So the logistics were already in place. The shipping lanes were well established from the days of the East India Company.
Okay, that makes sense.
But more importantly, India had a massive rural agricultural population. And crucially, many regions of India were suffering from severe economic devastation at that exact time.
Because of colonial policies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Famines were sweeping through, largely exacerbated by the crushing taxation and forced deindustrialization imposed by the British themselves.
So they create the poverty and then exploit the poverty.
It's a vicious cycle. The colonial elites looked at India and saw a seemingly infinite pool of desperate, hardworking people who were already subjects of the crown. To the cold, calculating colonial mindset, it was the most efficient, legally seamless solution.
Which sets the stage for a sprawling, deceptive recruitment campaign. The British and the plantation owners realize they need bodies, hundreds of thousands of them, to save their sugar empire.
Yes.
And that desperation gives birth to the Mirage. I really want to spend some real time exploring how this actually worked on the ground in India, because this is where the psychological manipulation and the heartbreak really begins.
Right. To find these workers, they didn't just, put up posters in cities. They sent specialized recruiters deep into the rural Indian subcontinent.
Who were they targeting?
The archival documents indicate they primarily targeted the Bhojpuri-speaking regions, places like Bihar and Uttar Pradesh in the north. But they also recruited heavily from the south and west, bringing in large numbers of Tamils, Telugus, and Marathis. These were agrarian societies. These were people whose entire ancestral identity was tied to the soil, but who were now watching their crops fail and their children starve under colonial economic pressures.
And the recruiters who walked into these villages, they weren't presenting a standard employment contract. Like, they weren't being honest. They were offering a highly curated, very specific deal.
Very specific deal, yeah.
On paper, if we look at the actual documents from the archives, what were these laborers legally agreeing to?
So on the physical paper, the terms were drafted to seem clear. And to a struggling farmer on the brink of starvation, perhaps even a lifeline.
What were the actual terms?
The standard contract stipulated a 5-year period of work on a designated sugar estate in Mauritius. In exchange, the laborer would receive a guaranteed monthly income of 5 rupees.
5 rupees a month.
Yes, alongside basic rations of rice, dal, and clothing. And perhaps the most critical clause, the one that got people to sign, the contract explicitly promised free repatriation.
A ticket home.
Exactly. A paid ticket back home to India at the exact end of those 5 years.
Okay, so 5 rupees a month, 5 years of work, basic rations, and a free ride home. If that is what actually happened, I mean, it's a harsh job, but it's a job.
Right.
But the reality of how this deal was sold is where the profound deception comes in. Because the people selling this deal, the recruiters, who were known as Girmityas, they were not neutral bureaucrats reading legal terms.
No, the Girmityas were incredibly skilled, highly manipulative salesmen. They were the tip of the spear.
What made them so effective?
What made them so effective is that they were often locals themselves. They were people who understood the subtle cultural dynamics, who spoke the regional dialects perfectly, and who knew exactly how to exploit the specific fears and hopes of a starving village.
So they knew exactly what buttons to push.
Yes. They would set up in the dusty village squares or at local religious fairs, and they would absolutely not mention the words sugar estate or 5-year grind.
What did they say?
They spun a fantasy. They spoke of a magical place across the water they called Mauritius.
Mauritius.
That was the whisper passed through the markets. Mauritius. A phantom word for a phantom island. It's a linguistic corruption of Mauritius, yes, but to the villagers it meant salvation.
Wow.
The Girmityas famously told the crowds that in Mauritius you could find gold simply by turning over the stones on the ground.
Just picking up rocks and finding gold.
Exactly. They promised that the work was light, that the food was abundant, and that anyone who went would return home in 5 years as a wealthy, respected member of their community.
And what is so deeply insidious here is what they intentionally omitted. Like, they are standing in these crowds, surrounded by desperate people talking about gold under stones, but they are completely erasing the physical reality of the environment they are sending them to.
Complete erasure.
They didn't mention the brutal, unforgiving tropical sun that cooks you alive in the fields. They certainly didn't mention the physical nature of sugarcane. I mean, the stalks are thick as tree branches and require heavy machetes to cut.
Yeah, it's backbreaking work.
Or that the leaves have literal thorns and razor-sharp edges that will shred your hands to ribbons. They just sold the mirage of Mauritius.
And you must picture the actual human beings listening to these Arcadias, men and women standing in long lines in the relentless heat of these impoverished villages.
Just hoping for a lifeline.
Yes, and the vast majority of them were completely illiterate. They could not read the complex, densely worded English or French legal fine print of the contracts they were being handed.
Right.
They were simply told a beautiful story and then asked to press their ink-stained thumbs onto a piece of paper.
And this is exactly what I want to push back on. History books and even some of the colonial records we're looking at, they constantly use the words contract or deal or agreement to describe this transaction.
Right.
But when you look at the massive asymmetry in information and power, it sounds less like a legitimate job offer and much more like a predatory scam.
It absolutely was.
It reminds me of signing a wildly complex, 50-page terms of service agreement today for a new app. You scroll to the bottom, you click agree, but all the severe penalties, the data extraction, the hidden costs, they are all buried in a legal language you literally cannot decode.
That's a great way to put it.
Except in this case, clicking agree didn't mean losing your data. It meant signing away your physical freedom and your bodily autonomy for half a decade.
That comparison captures the asymmetry perfectly. The Arcadias weaponized a profound vulnerability. But, and this is really crucial, we must not strip these villagers of their agency by viewing them solely as naive victims.
Right, because they made a choice.
Yes, whether they could read the English text or not, their primary motivation for putting their thumbprint on that paper was not simple greed for gold.
What was it?
It was hope. It was a powerful, fierce, deeply human hope for stability. They were watching their children waste away from famine. They were brave. They were making a calculated, monumental leap of faith based on a promise, fully intending to endure whatever was necessary to save their families.
That deep, protective hope is exactly what makes the deception so crushing to me. Fueled by these fabricated promises of Marrakech and driven by their own immense courage, these families packed up their entire lives.
Everything they had.
They said goodbye to their ancestral homes, to their aging parents, to the rivers and temples they knew, many of them truly believing they would be back in exactly 5 years with enough wealth to buy land.
Yes.
They gathered their few belongings in small bundles and walked for days to reach the port cities, completely unaware that the deal they had just signed would begin to morph and fracture the very moment they stepped onto the boats.
The journey itself was the first brutal shattering of the illusion. To reach Mauritius, they had to board massive wooden sailing ships at ports like Calcutta, Madras, or Bombay.
And just getting on the ship was a massive deal. Really.
Absolutely. Stepping off the docks of India and onto those ships meant crossing what was deeply feared in Hindu culture at the time, the Kalapani.
The Blackwater.
Yes, the Kalapani. You had to understand that this was not just a physical journey. It was an ancient cultural and religious taboo.
Can you unpack that? Why was it a taboo?
Well, for many Orthodox Hindus of that era, crossing the deep, dark ocean meant losing your caste. It meant severing your spiritual connection to the sacred geography of India, to the Ganges, to the soil of your ancestors. It meant stepping into a void of spiritual pollution. So even before the physical hardships of the voyage began, there was a profound, agonizing psychological terror involved in simply walking up the gangplank. They were risking their very souls.
And the physical conditions on those ships were horrific. We aren't talking about passenger liners here.
No, not at all.
The sources detail how these wooden ships were essentially cargo vessels, right? They were retrofitted with rudimentary wooden bunks to pack in as many human bodies as mathematically possible.
Like sardines.
Exactly. They were incredibly crowded, and the journeys could take anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks, depending on the trade winds.
4 to 8 weeks in the dark. The air below deck in the steerage holds was stifling, thick with heat and the smell of unwashed bodies.
I can't even stomach the thought of it.
And the rations they were promised were often meager, poorly cooked, and frequently spoiled by the humidity. Fresh water was strictly rationed and kept under lock and key by the captain.
So they are starving, thirsty, and terrified.
Yes. And under such cramped, unsanitary, and stressful conditions, sickness was inevitable and rampant. Cholera, dysentery, severe seasickness. The medical care was minimal to non-existent.
And people died.
Many did not survive the crossing. Their bodies were simply cast overboard. The waters of the Indian Ocean became a vast, unmarked graveyard for thousands who had dreamed of Marrakech.
But amidst that unimaginable darkness, the historical accounts we're looking at also highlight something incredibly moving.
Yes, they do.
the psychological resilience of the people on the holds of those ships. They were terrified, they were violently ill, they felt culturally untethered, but they didn't just give up and wait to die.
No, they didn't.
They actively comforted one another. People from completely different villages, different castes, different language groups, they were all thrown into this traumatic wooden crucible together. And they bonded.
They absolutely did.
They shared their meager water rations, they shared stories, and crucially, they sang. They sang the Botori folk songs from their villages to drown out the terrifying sound of the waves crashing against the hull.
It's amazing.
They forged an entirely new kind of social fabric right there in the dark.
It is one of the most profound testaments to the human spirit in our history. They called it the Jahaji Pai for the men and Jahaji Behen for the women, the brotherhood and sisterhood of the ship.
Jahaji Pai, I love that.
Yes. These bonds transcended old caste divisions. They were forged in shared survival, and these relationships often lasted a lifetime, replacing the extended families they had left behind in India.
That is incredibly beautiful.
It is. But eventually, after weeks of this agonizing limbo, the cry of land would echo from the upper deck. They would finally see the island of Mauritius rising from the water.
And if you were standing on the deck of a ship, arriving in Mauritius is visually stunning. It is volcanic, with dramatic mountain peaks, and it is violently, impossibly green.
It looks like paradise.
Right. So I can only imagine the emotional whiplash. After the horrors of the crossing, the sickness, the fear of the black water, seeing this beautiful island must have sparked a massive wave of relief, but also a tidal wave of nervous questions.
Oh, certainly. Is this it? Is this the paradise the Arcadias promised? Where's the gold under the stones?
Yeah.
The ships would navigate past the coral reefs and into the harbor of Port Louis, the capital. And the sheer relentless scale of this migration is staggering to comprehend.
Give us the numbers.
Between 1834 and 1920, nearly 700,000 Indian indentured laborers arrived at this specific port.
700?
700,000 souls pouring into a tiny island. And the focal point of that arrival, the physical threshold between their past lives in India and their indentured future, was a coastal immigration depot called the Apravasi Ghat.
Let's talk deeply about the Apravasi Ghat.
Yeah.
Because the visual reality of arriving there is just so visceral.
It really is.
The ships would dock, and the laborers, weakened, carrying their small bundles, would disembark. And the very first thing they had to do was climb a set of stone steps leading up from the water into the depot.
16 stone steps.
16 steps.
16 steps, carved from dark, rough volcanic rock. Those stones still exist today. The Apravasi Ghat is a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
Oh, wow, you can still go see them.
You can, and when you stand at the bottom and look up at them, you realize they still hold the invisible, crushing weight of every broken deal, every shattered dream.
Yeah.
Because the moment they reached the top of those steps and entered the courtyard of the depot, the psychological reality of their situation became horrifyingly clear. The relief of surviving the ocean vanished instantly.
They thought they were arriving as hopeful settlers. They thought they were contracted employees, ready to do some work, earn their 5 rupees, and go home.
That was the mirage.
But the moment they entered the Apravasi Ghat, they were immediately processed as subhuman commodities. They were stripped and medically inspected by colonial doctors, examined like livestock to ensure they were fit for hard labor.
Just horrible.
But the most devastating part of the arrival process, and this is a bureaucratic detail that just stops you in your tracks, was the deliberate, systematic erasure of their identity.
Yes. The British colonial administration prized efficiency above humanity. In the vast ledgers of the Immigration Office, the complex, multisyllabic names of the laborers, their village lineages, their family histories, it was all deemed too difficult for the clerks to pronounce, too cumbersome to record accurately.
So what did they do?
Their names were literally stripped away from the official record. In their place, each person was issued a small stamped metal disc attached to a string to hang around their neck.
Oh my God.
And on that disc was a registration number. From that exact moment on, in the eyes of the law, the police, and the plantation owners, you were no longer Ram or Sita or Govant. You were immigrant number 3456.
Think about the emotional and psychological violence of that exact moment. I really want you, listening to this, to try and process that toll.
It's hard to even fathom.
You survived this horrific, traumatic sea crossing. You brave the taboo of the Kalapani, holding on to the desperate hope of Mauritius, of feeding your starving children back home. You walk up those 16 stone steps, breathing the air of dry land for the first time in weeks, and instantly Your very identity, the name your mother whispered to you, is erased by a clerk with a pen.
Just gone.
It is replaced by an etched number on a metal tag. How does a human being even begin to process that level of systemic institutional betrayal? You realize instantly, you aren't a worker, you are inventory.
It is an act of profound dehumanization. It was a psychological tactic, consciously or unconsciously, designed to break their connection to their past, to sever their sense of self-worth, and to enforce total passive obedience to the colonial machine.
Right, because numbers don't fight back.
You are a number, and numbers do not complain. And once they were tagged and numbered, they were moved deeper into the depot, into the holding sheds. This was where the final remnants of the mirage were burned away.
The sources describe these holding sheds in grim, granular detail. The depot had to process massive numbers of people efficiently. At the absolute peak of the system, up to 1,000 immigrants a day were arriving.
It was a factory assembly line.
They were herded into 6 large, cavernous sheds to wait for the plantation owners or their representatives to come and literally claim their designated lots of workers.
And the physical conditions inside these holding sheds were appalling. After surviving the cramped holds of the ship, they expected decent accommodations.
Like beds, at least.
Instead, they were forced to sleep on the hard floor. And the floor was covered in bitumen, a sticky, black, asphalt-like tar substance.
Tar? Why tar?
The British claimed it was used for hygiene to prevent dampness, but it was harsh, unforgiving, and in the tropical heat, it would become soft and suffocatingly hot.
That is just evil.
They would stay in these crowded sheds, sleeping on boiling black tar, sometimes for 3 to 5 days, before being divided up and loaded onto ox carts to be distributed to the respective local sugar estates scattered across the island.
So they are carted off to the sugar estates. The gates close behind them. The 5-year clock supposedly begins. And what does the reality of the work actually look like?
It was hell.
Arcadia's promised easy wealth and gold under stones. What was the grueling day-to-day existence of an indentured laborer in the sugarcane fields of 19th century Mauritius?
It was an existence defined by total physical exhaustion and absolute panoptic control. The workday began long before dawn, usually around 4 a.m. Yes, the Sirdar, the overseer, who was often an older Indian immigrant, elevated to a position of authority, and armed with a stick or a whip, would wake them by banging on an iron rail.
Oh, wow. So they used their own people against them.
Exactly, a classic divide-and-conquer tactic.
Hmm.
They were marched directly into the fields, and you must understand, sugarcane is not wheat.
Right.
It must be cut by hand close to the root using heavy, broad-bladed machetes. The stalks are thick, dense, and heavy. The leaves are covered in microscopic silica and literal thorns that act like razors against bare skin.
So you're just getting sliced up all day.
All day. By midday, the tropical sun is beating down relentlessly, the humidity is suffocating, and the air is thick with cane dust. They worked these long, grueling hours with only severely short, heavily monitored rest periods.
And it wasn't just the fields, right?
No, aside from the fields, they were also forced into backbreaking public infrastructure projects, hauling volcanic rocks to build the roads and bridges of the colony.
And what about their freedom of movement? Because a modern employee, even one with a terrible boss, can quit. Or at the very least, they can go home at the end of their shift, walk to the local pub, or visit a friend across town.
No, that was the primary mechanism of the trap. The plantation owners operated these vast estates essentially as sovereign open-air prisons.
Recent.
Yes. The laborers were housed in cramped, unsanitary, rudimentary barracks known as camps, situated right on the edge of the cane fields. And they were absolutely not allowed to leave the physical boundaries of the estate without a special written passe-laissez-passer signed by the estate owner or manager.
And if they did, like if a laborer simply wanted to walk to the nearby town to buy provisions, or tried to visit a Jahaji Pai who had been assigned to a neighboring estate, what happened?
The colonial government, acting entirely on behalf of the sugar oligarchs, passed stringent vagrancy laws specifically designed to control the physical bodies of the Indian population.
Of course they did.
If an indentured laborer was found on a public road or off the estate without that signed piece of paper, they were immediately arrested by the colonial police. They were classified as vagrants.
Even though they had jobs.
Even though they were fully employed, yes. If someone missed a day of work due to sheer physical collapse or illness, or if they tried to run away from the sheer brutality of the conditions to hide in the forests, they were hunted down.
This is literally, they're being hunted.
They were severely punished, subjected to physical abuse, or thrown into the notorious vagrant depot, a prison specifically built to house disobedient laborers.
Okay, let's look at the financial side of the deal.
Yeah.
Because theoretically, the entire point of enduring this hellscape for the laborer was the 5 rupees a month.
Right. The money.
That was the money they were going to use to feed their families back in Bihar or Madras. Were they actually being paid?
Very, very often, no.
Unbelievable.
The wages were frequently withheld, delayed for months at a time, or arbitrarily reduced by the estate owners who acted as judge and jury on the estates. But the financial manipulation goes much deeper than simple, direct theft.
How does it go deeper than just stealing their wages?
The owners utilized a highly engineered, deeply predatory administrative system of penalties to ensure the laborers could never actually fulfill the terms of
manipulate time and debt.
It was a brutal piece of accounting known as the double cut system.
The double cut?
Yes, it worked like this. If a laborer was genuinely sick with malaria and missed one single day of work, the estate owner would legally deduct 2 full days of wages from their monthly pay.
Wait, if I'm sick for 1 day, you steal 2 days of my pay.
Exactly.
That is insane.
If a laborer was deemed insubordinate by the Sirdar, or if they simply didn't cut enough cane to meet the incredibly high, arbitrary daily quotas set by the owners, they were penalized. And the penalty wasn't just financial.
What else could they take?
Time. Their contract would be extended. Days, weeks, and months were added onto their indenture as punishment.
So they just tacked on extra years?
Yes. So a 5-year contract could easily bureaucratically stretch into 7, 8, or 10 years of bondage simply through the stroke of the owner's pen in the ledger.
It's like a predatory payday loan, but instead of compounding interest, the currency is your physical freedom.
That's exactly what it is.
And what about the final, most important piece of the Arcacia's promise? The free repatriation. The paid ticket back to India at the end of the contract.
It was intentionally, spectacularly disorganized.
Because they didn't want them to leave.
Think about it from the oligarchs' perspective. They did not want to lose their experienced, acclimated workforce and have to pay the exorbitant shipping costs to import new, weak laborers from India.
Right. It hurts the bottom line.
Exactly. So when a laborer finally managed to survive and complete their extended, heavily penalized term, they would walk to the immigration office in Port Louis to claim their ticket.
And what happened?
And they would find that there were mysteriously no ships available for months, or that the administrative paperwork required to prove they had completed their term was impossibly complex, required fees they couldn't pay, or had been lost by the clerks.
How convenient.
They were deliberately structurally trapped on the island.
This is exactly where I have to pause and push back on the historical terminology we're using.
Please do.
We keep using the phrase indentured contract. We use bureaucratic words like employer, laborer, wages, and penalties.
The colonial vocabulary.
Yes. But if we strip away the euphemisms and look at the raw mechanics, if the wages you are promised are legally stolen through the double cut system, if you are legally forbidden from leaving the physical premises of your workplace under threat of imprisonment, if you are hunted by police for walking on a public road without a permission slip from a white man, and your supposed 5-year contract is magically extended against your will whenever you try to leave.
I know where you're going with this.
At what point do we stop using the polite colonial term indentured labor and just call it what it functionally was? Slavery rebranded for a post-1833 world.
It is a vital question, and functionally, the cruelty, the extraction of labor, and the restriction of physical movement were nearly identical.
Right.
But, and this is a crucial historical distinction we must defend, you have to look deeper than just the physical abuse, because that thin legal pretense of a contract is exactly what ultimately saved them.
Wait, how does a fake contract save them?
Because legally, however deceptive that piece of paper was, it classified them as subjects of the crown with nominal legal rights, not as human property to be bought and sold forever.
Okay.
The enslaved African and Malagasy people who preceded them were legally property. Their children were born as property. The indentured laborers, despite the horrific abuses, were legally free citizens fulfilling a civil contract. And decades later, they would use that exact legal distinction, that very paper that trapped them, to petition the courts, to demand land ownership rights, to organize labor unions, and to slowly dismantle the power of the very men who oppressed them.
Oh, wow.
If they were legally classified as property, none of that later resistance would have been legally possible within the colonial framework. The British built a loophole of freedom into their system of exploitation, and our ancestors eventually pried it open.
That is a phenomenal point. The oppressor's own legal framework provided the eventual tools for dismantling it.
Exactly.
And this is exactly where the narrative of this deep dive pivots.
Yeah.
This is where the story shifts from a chronicle of immense systemic tragedy to a story of incredible, undeniable power.
The triumph of the human spirit.
Because the colonial machine wanted obedient, broken numbers. But the people who climbed those 16 stone steps were human beings with rich, complex cultures, deep faith, and an absolute unbreakable will to survive.
They were so much more than what the British saw.
Even in the darkest hours on those prison-like estates, their true strength began to shine through. I want to talk about the emotional core of this survival. Let's talk about the night fires.
Ah, the night fires. If you want to understand the soul of the Mauritian story, you really must look here.
Tell me about them.
You see, after those endless, agonizing days in the hot sun, cutting cane until their hands bled and their backs gave out, the laborers would return to the squalor of the camps.
Yeah.
The estate owners expected them to collapse, sleep, and wake up as machines the next day. But they did not surrender to the despair. When the sun went down and the Surtur retreated, they would gather together in the dirt between the barracks and they would light fires.
What happened around those fires? I mean, it sounds like more than just staying warm.
Oh, it was much more. It was a reclamation of their humanity. Around those small flames, they ceased to be immigrant number 3456.
They got their names back.
Yes. They would pool whatever meager rations of rice and dal they had managed to keep. And they would remember who they were. They sang the Bhojpuri folk songs they had brought across the Kalapani, songs of the harvest, songs of love, songs of the monsoon rains they would never see again.
That must have been so bittersweet.
It was. But the act of singing in their mother tongue was a psychological shield against a system that tried to erase their voices.
The sources mention they also leaned heavily on their religious texts during these nights.
Yes, profoundly so. They would recite the epic verses of the Ramayana from memory, or from small, battered texts they had smuggled in their bundles.
The Ramayana.
And the Ramayana took on a deep, immediate resonance for them. They saw direct, powerful parallels between Lord Rama's 14-year exile into the dangerous forest and their own cruel exile across the Black Water.
Wow, I never thought of it that way.
If Rama could endure the wilderness, defeat the demons, and return to the light, then so could they. They celebrated their native festivals, Diwali, Holi, Taipusam, Kavadi, using whatever makeshift scavenged materials they could find.
Like what?
A little oil in a clay pot for Diwali. Just a tiny flame. In those moments around the fire, under the strange Mauritian stars, they were no longer isolated victims. They were a community.
They held on to each other.
They found joy, they found spiritual solace, and in doing so, they preserved their souls against all odds.
It is a beautiful form of spiritual and cultural resistance. By actively refusing to let go of their language, their faith, and their joy, they were subtly but firmly defying the entire colonial system that wanted to reduce them to mindless inventory.
Absolutely.
And as time went on, this psychological resilience began to translate into physical roots. As the decades passed and the indentured contracts technically began to expire, even with all the double-cut traps and the penalties, a massive, crucial demographic shift occurred on the island.
This is where everything changes.
When the indenture period finally legally ended for individuals, what did they do? Did they fight to get back on the ships to India?
Some did manage to navigate the bureaucracy and return, yes. But an overwhelming majority, fully 2/3 of all the hundreds of thousands of indentured laborers who were brought to Mauritius, made a monumental, historically defining decision.
They stayed?
They chose to stay. They chose to settle permanently on the very island that had caused them so much suffering.
Why? I mean, after everything they endured, the lies, the tar floors, the whips, why would you stay?
Because you have to look at the timeline. By the time a contract actually ended, 10, 15, or 20 years might have passed.
Oh, right.
For many, India was no longer home. Their parents had passed away. The villages they remembered had changed. But more importantly, Mauritius was now the birthplace of their children.
Their kids were Mauritian.
Yes, their sweat and their ancestors' ashes were now in this soil. So those who were finally no longer bound by contracts began to systematically carve out a life outside the gates of the estates.
How did they do that? They had no money.
They took the tiny, pathetic savings they had managed to hide from the double-cut system and they pooled it together. They engaged in massive land buyouts, a movement known as the Mauritian.
More so.
Yes. They bought tiny plots of marginal, rocky, difficult land that the sugar states deemed too poor for cane cultivation.
The scraps.
The scraps. And they transformed it.
They worked it themselves.
They worked their own land with a fierce, possessive dedication. They cleared the rocks by hand. They planted vegetables, bred cows and goats. They set up small businesses.
They became entrepreneurs.
They did. They became small-scale traders, hawkers, milkmen delivering to the towns. They built modest homes with thatched roofs. They started families, and they created entire, vibrant, small villages across the island, completely independent from the sugar oligarchs.
That is just incredible.
They took the immense agricultural skills they had been forced to use for the benefit of others and finally used them to feed themselves and build their own wealth. They passed down their stories, their traditions, and importantly, a deep, hard-won love for the land itself. They made it theirs.
And as this independent community puts down permanent economic roots, the demographics of the colony begin to radically change.
Oh, completely.
The sheer numbers of the Indian population become impossible for the British colonial government to ignore or control through simple vagrancy laws. And there's a fascinating legal milestone in the historical sources, the Law of 1899.
Yes, 1899 was a massive turning point. Up until then, the British colonial government still stubbornly viewed the Indians as a temporary, transient workforce, denying them civic rights.
Right.
But the reality on the ground was undeniable. So despite fierce opposition from the Franco-Mauritian elites who feared losing their political monopoly, a law was passed allowing the children of immigrants who were born on the island to automatically acquire French and British nationality.
Wow. So they were officially recognized.
This gave them a permanent legal foothold, a concrete recognition of belonging. They were no longer immigrants, they were Mauritians.
And the Indian community in Mauritius was also diversifying during this period, right? It wasn't just the descendants of the indentured agricultural laborers anymore.
No, the sources mention a later, completely different wave of free immigrants arriving from India.
Who were they?
Well, during the later part of the 19th and early 20th century, the British brought in free immigrants for specific roles. These were often employed in the armed forces or as police officers, clerks, and security personnel.
Okay, so more administrative.
Exactly. We also saw a substantial, vital influx of free immigrants from regions like Gujarat and Sindh.
Ah, I saw that in the documents.
Yes, these were Muslim and Hindu men arriving as independent traders, businessmen, and textile merchants. They brought capital, international commercial networks, and a different kind of urban savvy, which added a powerful new economic and social layer to the established agrarian Indian diaspora on the island.
So as we enter the 20th century, you have this massive, growing, increasingly diverse community. They own land, they run businesses, they have legal status as citizens, and they have economic power.
Yes, they do.
But politically, they are still completely marginalized. The actual levers of power, the voting rights, the government councils are still entirely in the hands of the tiny Franco-Mauritian elite and the British administrators.
That was the final barrier.
But that status quo is about to be shattered. I want you to trace the political awakening of this community for us. How do they go from marginalized farmers to demanding a seat at the table and eventually taking over the room?
It is a masterclass in slow, deliberate organization. And the awakening was actually intellectual and spiritual before it became strictly political.
How so?
In the period between the two world wars, new, radical ideas began circulating through the villages. A movement from India called the Arya Samaj began to deeply infiltrate the Hindu community in Mauritius.
What was the Arya Samaj and why was it so dangerous to the colonial elites?
Well, the Arya Samaj was a Hindu reform movement that emphasized rationalism, education, social equality, and self-reliance. It actively rejected the rigid caste hierarchies that the British sometimes tried to exploit.
Oh, I bet the British hated that.
They certainly did. But most importantly, it provided a decentralized, community-driven framework for education. The colonial government was not providing proper schools for the children of laborers.
Because an educated workforce is a dangerous workforce.
Exactly. So the Arya Samaj inspired the community to pool their pennies and build their own evening schools, known as Baithkas, right in the villages.
They built their own schools.
Yes, they taught their children to read and write, and when you teach an exploited class to read, you give them the tools to analyze their own exploitation. Building a school became an act of profound political rebellion.
That gives me chills.
It sparked a widespread clamor for social justice, for better labor conditions, and for a voice.
They realized that their sheer demographic numbers were their greatest weapon, but only if they were educated and organized. They needed representation in the halls of power.
Yes.
And that leads to a massive psychological political milestone in 1926. Up until this point, there had never been a single Indo-Mauritian representative in the Legislative Council. The government was entirely white.
Completely closed off.
But in the 1926 elections, that barrier falls.
It was a shock to the establishment that echoed across the island. Two men, Dunputh Lala and Rajkumar Gujadhar, backed by the newly educated, organized rural voters, became the first Indo-Mauritians to be elected to the Legislative Council.
That is huge.
It shattered the myth of colonial invincibility. It proved definitively that the descendants of the indentured laborers could organize, they could vote strategically, and they could win against the oligarchs.
And from 1926 onwards, the momentum is unstoppable. Over the next few decades, Indo-Mauritians, alongside Creole leaders, are constantly at the forefront of the struggle for labor rights, fighting to completely dismantle the remnants of the plantation system.
Yes, they organized massive, powerful labor unions. They staged strikes that paralyzed the sugar industry.
And finally, shitting them where it hurts.
Exactly. They demanded fair wages, decent working conditions, an end to predatory penalties, and ultimately, universal suffrage. The right for every adult to vote, regardless of property ownership.
And as we moved past the Second World War, they truly begin stamping their dominance on the political arena.
It was not a perfectly smooth transition, of course. Power is never surrendered willingly.
Right, there's always pushback.
The 1960s saw a dangerous, painful rise in racial and political tensions, with riots and assaults as the old Franco-Mauritian colonial order realized it was rapidly losing its grip on the island.
But they held their ground. They utilized the very democratic structures the British had introduced to outmaneuver them.
They did.
And all of this decades-long struggle, from the defiant songs around the night fires, to the grassroots schools of the Arya Samaj, to the labor unions and the ballot box, it all culminates in the ultimate victory. The independence of Mauritius in 1968.
A glorious day.
The nation was finally free from British rule, and the descendants of the terrified people brought over to be disposable gears in the colonial machine were now the prime ministers and presidents steering the ship of state.
It is a breathtaking historical trajectory to go from the bitumen floors of the holding sheds to the highest offices of a sovereign republic in just a few generations.
It really is.
And if we look at modern Mauritius today, the legacy of that journey is the very foundation, the absolute bedrock of the nation. The Indian diaspora looms incredibly large in the political, economic, and cultural mold of the island.
Let's look at the actual landscape today. The demographic data shows that Mauritians of Indian descent now comprise around 68% of the country's estimated 1.3 million population.
Yes, 68%.
That is massive. And it is a beautifully diverse group within itself. The majority are Hindus, but there are highly significant Muslim, Christian, and Buddhist minorities within that diaspora.
And their political prominence is absolute. Since independence in 1968, the democratic will of the people has meant that all presidents of the republic, except for Karl Othman, and all prime ministers, except for Paul Berenger, have been members of this Indo-Mauritian community.
But it is so much more than just political representation. It is the entire sensory and cultural atmosphere of the island. The language, for instance.
Oh, the language is beautiful.
The mother tongue of almost all Mauritians today is Mauritian Creole, which is this dynamic synthesis of French, African languages, and Indian dialects. But many Indo-Mauritians still proudly use their ancestral languages, right?
Oh, definitely. Bhojpuri, Hindi, Tamil, Urdu, they are still spoken alongside Creole in homes and communities across the island.
The culture they fought so hard to preserve around those fires is now vibrant and pervasive across the entire society.
Because almost 50% of the country's population is Hindu, most major Hindu celebrations, Mahashivaratri, Diwali, Ganesh Chaturthi, are not just private events.
They're big deals.
They are massive national public holidays, celebrated and respected by everyone on the island, regardless of their own faith. The Indian influence is deeply felt in the spicy, rich local street food, in the rhythms of the Sega and Bhojpuri music, in the arts,
And the movies, right?
even Indian cinema, Bollywood films are massively popular across all demographics, drawing huge crowds to the cinemas in Port Louis.
I am just marveling at this transformation. It's almost hard to wrap your head around. The analogy that keeps coming to mind is, well, they literally planted the fragile seeds of their own culture in foreign, deeply hostile soil.
Hostile soil, exactly.
They were brought there by wealthy men who intended just to harvest them, to use them up and discard them like the cane stalks. But the people tended to those cultural seeds in the dark, and over generations, those seeds grew into the towering protective canopy of modern Mauritius.
That is a wonderful way to phrase it.
It is an incredible story of pluralism, resilience, and peace growing out of a foundation of extreme, calculated exploitation.
It is exactly that. But it is crucial to note the wisdom of the leaders who emerged from the struggle.
What do you mean?
While political rule has been heavily influenced by the Indo-Mauritian majority, the political institutions and the constitution they built in post-colonial Mauritius have carefully, deliberately ensured the representation and protection of all different ethnic groups.
They didn't just take over and punish everyone else.
No, they didn't. The Creoles, the Franco-Mauritians, the Sino-Mauritians, they all have a place. They didn't seek to replicate the exclusionary oppression they had suffered.
That is real leadership.
This deliberate fostering of justice, power sharing, and equity has been the major factor enabling Mauritius to maintain peace and remarkable political stability in a region where ethnic fragmentation often leads to conflict.
Yeah.
The vibrant Indian diaspora today is truly a shining example of values like peace, pluralism, shared progress, and universal brotherhood.
So what does this all mean for us today? Let's take a step back and look at the massive, sweeping journey we've explored in this deep dive.
It's been quite a journey.
We started in the dusty, hopeful villages of the Bhojpuri-speaking regions, where vulnerable, brave people signed away their physical freedom based on the engineered, deceptive promises of the Arcadias.
And mirage.
We crossed the terrifying Kalapani in crowded, disease-ridden wooden ships, forging bonds of brotherhood in the dark. We climbed those dehumanizing 16-stone steps of the Apravasi Ghat, where ancient names were violently traded for metal numbers.
Yes.
We felt the sheer brutality of the sugarcane fields, the razor-sharp leaves, and the prison-like grip of the double-cut system.
And we saw them survive it all.
And we traced the slow, miraculous rise of a people who gathered around night fires to preserve their souls, eventually stepping out of the fields, building their own schools, and claiming their rightful place as the leaders of a vibrant, diverse, and incredibly stable modern nation.
It is a profound testament to the fact that while colonial systems, or any systems of extreme capitalist extraction, can try to reduce humans to numbers on a ledger, they can never fully extinguish the spirit.
Absolutely.
The ancestral memory, the burning desire for dignity, the human soul is remarkably resistant to being categorized as inventory.
That is so true. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to ponder over the next few days.
Giving them something to think about.
Consider the profound, almost poetic historical irony of the indentured labor system we just discussed.
Oh, the irony is thick.
The British and Franco-Mauritian colonial elites designed a highly deceptive, brutal machine specifically to exploit a vulnerable group of people for cheap labor. They wanted bodies that were weak, ignorant, compliant, and ultimately disposable.
Right.
But by bringing hundreds of thousands of Indians to Mauritius, the elites inadvertently handed those exact same people the sheer demographic numbers, the hardened resilience, the shared grievance, and ultimately the democratic power to eventually overthrow the colonial order entirely.
They inherited the land.
They shaped the destiny of an entire nation. The oppressors, in their greed, literally imported the architects of their own obsolescence.
They absolutely did.
So the question I leave you with is this. When you look around the world today, at modern systems of hidden or exploitative labor, the people working in shadows, without proper contracts, to build our gleaning cities or deliver our packages or harvest our food, consider what vibrant, powerful future those workers might quietly be building for themselves right now, completely out of sight of the people who think they control them.
A very powerful question to carry forward into the modern world. History is rarely written by the oligarchs in the end. It is always eventually written by those who labor in the soil.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the history behind the world around you. Keep looking for the complex human stories hidden beneath the surface of the official records, and we will see you next time.